Thank you for joining us. Across the Barry Plant network, we've been entrusted with the management of over 33,000 properties on behalf of their owners and investors. It's a great responsibility, and we do thank you for putting your trust in us to do that for you. As I'm sure you're aware, the Victorian Government has made significant changes to the Residential Tenancies Act, most of which are effective from Monday the 29th of March 2021. It's important to note that these changes are not changes made by Barry Plant. They will apply to every property management company across Victoria and every rental property and every landlord or rental provider. Following an extensive period of public and industry consultation, during which there were over 700 submissions, there are now 132 changes to the Act. Firstly, I think there are two important things that we need to understand. Firstly, why have these changes been made? Well, essentially, the government wants to make renting safer, fairer, and more transparent. And secondly, whilst there are new minimum standards that must be complied with in terms of the amenity and safety of the property, the research conducted by the government during the consultation process showed that approximately 90% of all rental properties already complied with those standards. So for most landlords, there will be little or nothing they need to do to comply with the new standards. However, there are new processes and procedures that must be followed that will affect every landlord. Now, I don't propose to go through all 132 changes to the legislation, but let's have a look at some of the more important ones. Firstly, some simple changes to terminology. Tenants will now be referred to as renters, landlords will be known as residential rental providers or just rental providers, and leases will become rental agreements. So it might take us all a while to get used to the new terminology, but it will appear on all documentation moving forward. The next key change I'd like to touch on are the forms that we'll be using. Whilst there are a number of new forms, there are two in particular that I'd like to draw to your attention. The disclosure before letting is a new form that must be provided to the renter before they sign a rental agreement. So, as the rental provider, we will be asking you to complete a disclosure document prior to the commencement of the lease. The second form I want to mention is the condition report, which must now include the dates on which the electrical and gas appliances and smoke alarms were last inspected and serviced. One of the key changes to the legislation is now more stringent requirements on safety checks to be conducted by qualified professionals, so let's have a look at some of those now. Smoke alarms must be checked every year, whilst gas and electrical appliances must be tested and checked every 2 years. If you have a swimming pool or your property is in a designated bushfire-prone area, there will be other checks required, and you should speak to your Barry Plant property manager about those requirements. Minimum standards have been one of the big talking points around the new legislation, but for the majority of landlords, your property will already meet the required standards. As you can see, many of the standards are very basic, including such items as a dedicated cooking area, a working toilet, hot and cold water, and window coverings. However, a couple of items that you should be aware of and may need to plan for, particularly if you have an older property, are electrical switchboards that must meet prescribed standards, including circuit breakers and fixed heaters in good working order that have a 2-star energy rating. You have until the 29th of March 2023 to address these items if you need to. There's also been a lot of discussion about modifications that renters will now be able to make to properties, and it is one of the more complex areas of the legislation, so let's go through some of that now. Essentially, modifications will fall into one of two categories. Modifications that can be made without needing the consent of the rental provider, and those that do require consent from the rental provider, noting that the provider cannot unreasonably withhold that consent. Here are some examples of modifications that can be made without the need to obtain consent from the rental provider, most of which are quite straightforward, such as installing a wireless doorbell or a lock on a letterbox. The new legislation also draws a distinction between heritage-listed properties and properties that are not heritage-listed, in terms of the modifications a renter can make without consent. Again, you should speak to your Barry Plant property manager if you have any queries on this issue, particularly if your property is heritage-listed. There are also many modifications that do require consent from the rental provider, and we've listed some of those here. But it's important to note that consent cannot be unreasonably withheld. This is one of the more complex areas of the new legislation, and one in particular where you should seek guidance from your property manager. As we mentioned, there are limited circumstances where the rental provider may refuse consent, including where the modification would result in additional maintenance costs if not restored, if the modification would significantly change the premises, or a notice to vacate has been given. So as you can see, there are a number of obligations on the rental provider, but the renter also has some very specific obligations when it comes to modifications. Renters will be required to cover the costs associated with these modifications. They will be required to reverse the modifications unless the rental provider and renter agree to keep those modifications, and renters must leave the property reasonably clean and in the same condition as at the start of the rental agreement, taking into account fair wear and tear. And finally, the last item I want to touch on relates to the end of lease, and particularly around notices to vacate. There are some significant changes here, and it's really important that rental providers understand what these changes are and the impact of them. The first significant change is that the ability to bring a lease to an end for no specified reason with 120 days notice no longer exists. At the end of the first term of a tenancy, for example 12 months, you may bring the lease to an end with the appropriate notice, but it is important to understand that the only time you can do this is at the end of the first term of the lease. You cannot do it for any subsequent term. That means it is vital that during that first term, you determine if you are happy to potentially have a long-term relationship with that renter in your property. You will still have the ability to terminate the lease at the end of a lease period for other reasons, such as if the property is to be demolished, to be used for business, to be occupied by the residential rental provider, or to be sold. However, if you provide the appropriate notice for one of these situations and then your circumstances change and you do not proceed, for example, with the sale of your home, you must not let the premises for a period of 6 months after the date on which you gave the notice. If you do, the penalties are very severe. So as you can see, the changes are significant, and I've really only scratched the surface with the changes that will be coming in. More than ever, I encourage you to work closely with your Barry Plant property manager, and together we'll help you successfully navigate these changes. And once again, thank you for trusting Barry Plant to manage your property.